In a small country church in America, a young black orphan wandered in searching for a place to sit when he noticed a lonely woman seated quietly in the last pew. As every family joined hands in prayer, only the boy and the woman had no one beside them. Sensing a silent bond, the boy reached out and took her hand, never realizing that this simple touch would go on to save both their lives forever. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thought. The small country church stood quietly at the edge of town, its wooden frame weathered by years of wind and sun. The bell had rung moments ago, and now the sanctuary was alive with the voices of hymns. Families filled the pews. Fathers pressed their palms against the backs of hymnals. Mothers leaned close to whisper lines to their children, and little ones swung their legs restlessly. Shoes tapping against the polished floorboards. The air smelled faintly of pine from the candles mixed with the warm dust of old hymnals. Near the middle of the church, an entire pew sat empty, except for one woman. She looked older than her years, 35, though sorrow had etched lines across her forehead and pulled down the corners of her mouth. Her hair, once thick and golden, was tied back in a knot that had lost its neatness. She clutched a worn Bible to her chest, as though it might hold her together, her knuckles pale from the pressure. Her name had once meant something on this street. People remembered the scent of her bakery, the rolls that filled the air each morning with butter and cinnamon, but the accident had taken her husband and her little boy in a single cruel moment, and she had locked the door of that bakery forever. Now she lived alone in a house that smelled of dust rather than yeast, silence instead of laughter. She came to church each Sunday, not because she found peace here, but because she could not bear to lose even this thin thread of community. Her eyes scanned the congregation as the hymn ended. Families everywhere, husbands bowing their heads beside wives, children leaning against the arms of mothers, whispering questions about heaven in voices too soft to hear. She lowered her gaze quickly, afraid of what envy might spill across her face. At the back of the church, a boy slipped inside. His clothes were too small for him. The sleeves stretched, the knees worn thin. His skin was the color of coffee, with no cream. His eyes alert, but cautious, like a stray animal unsure if it was safe to enter. 17 years old, though he carried himself with the weight of someone much older. He had no family left, no home, no one waiting for him. On the streets, the world passed him by as if he were invisible. But here, in the crowded hush of the church, he could pretend, if only for an hour, that he was part of something larger. He kept his head low as he moved through the aisle, searching for a place where no one would ask questions. The boy noticed the woman sitting alone. Her pew looked like a small island in the sea of families, her loneliness as visible as the candlelight flickering against her face. He hesitated. His instinct told him to stay at the back, keep his distance, avoid notice. But something in her stillness mirrored his own emptiness, as if she carried the same hollow weight he felt pressing on his chest. He moved closer, step by step, his sneakers scuffing softly against the wooden floor. The preacher's voice rose at the pulpit, asking the congregation to join hands in prayer. Across the sanctuary, palms touched palms, fingers laced together. Children tugged on their parents' sleeves and were pulled into the circle of warmth. But at the center of that empty pew, the woman bowed her head alone. The boy slid into the pew beside her, his heart hammered against his ribs, and for a moment he nearly turned back. He thought of leaving her in peace, thought of disappearing as he always did. but instead he let his thin, trembling hand reach across the space between them. Her body stiffened at the sudden contact. She opened her eyes, startled, her breath catching as she looked down at the dark hand gripping her own pale fingers. Her first instinct was to pull away, to reclaim the safety of solitude. Then she saw his face, a boy younger than her lost son, yet carrying the same hunger in his eyes. Hunger not for food, but for connection, for belonging, for someone to see, him. Tears rose unbidden to her eyes. She had not expected this fragile, desperate trust from a stranger. The pressure of his hand was not strong, but it was steady. She felt the warmth of his skin, the raw sincerity in the gesture. The church continued its prayer, voices weaving together in solemn unison, but for her the sound faded to a low hum. Her heart beat louder. In that single moment, she was no longer a widow clutching an old Bible, no longer the woman who had buried her family and her laughter with them. She was simply human, seen, touched, remembered. The boy did not look up. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, as if afraid she might push him away. But when he felt her hand relax, when her fingers curved gently to hold his in return, his shoulders loosened. He let out a breath he did not know he was holding. For her, the world shifted. The pew was not empty anymore. The candlelight seemed warmer, the voices of prayer richer. She blinked through the blur of tears, holding on to that small hand as though it anchored her to the present. And for him, the sanctuary stopped being just a building. For the first time since he could remember, he was not on the outside looking in. He was connected. The prayer ended. The congregation whispered their amens, but the two of them stayed still, hands entwined in silent defiance of their loneliness. It was only a single touch. Yet in that touch, something fragile and profound had begun. The Sundays that followed carried a new rhythm. The boy no longer lingered at the back of the sanctuary. He walked straight to the pew where she sat, sliding in beside her, as though it had always been his place. Their silence grew familiar, no longer awkward, but heavy with a strange kind of comfort. She found herself expecting him, even glancing at the door before each service began, her heart sinking. If he was not there on time, for years she had walked through life like a ghost. Each morning had been the same. She woke in a silent house, boiled water for tea she hardly drank, and sat at a table that never held another chair. She had told herself this was survival. Endure the days, let time move forward, breathe, and nothing more. But in truth, she had stopped living when the accident buried her family. Now, watching the boy fold his thin hands in prayer beside her, she felt a stirring she had not allowed herself in years, the thought that perhaps she could begin again. She watched him measure flour with careful hands and realized he measured himself out of the world too. Always useful, never asking. He should have a desk, a teacher, a bell that told him where to be. He should have more than survival. On Monday morning, she walked him to the small brick school 3 blocks away, the one where the maple trees dropped red leaves across the sidewalk. They sat together in the front office, the clock ticking above a faded pennant, while a secretary slid forms across the counter. Her hand trembled when she reached the line that read, "Relationship to student." She pressed the pen down, the ink catching for a second before it flowed. She wrote, "Guardian," then dotted the I as if sealing a vow. The principal, Mr. Carter, with kind eyes and sleeves rolled to his forearms, shook the boy's hand and said he would do fine. The boy stared at his shoes and nodded once. She answered questions about addresses and meals and emergency contacts, hearing her own voice steady as she claimed him in every field that asked who should be called if anything went wrong. When they stepped back into the sunlight, she felt lighter, as if the papers had given bones to a hope she had only dared to whisper. They stopped at the thrift store on the corner for a collared shirt and a sweater that still held the shape of the last boy who wore it. She bought notebooks with blue lines, a pencil case that zipped cleanly, and a pack of pencils with bright pink erasers. That night, she packed a lunch in a brown paper bag, turkey on soft bread, an apple polished on her sleeve, 2 cookies wrapped in waxed paper, the way she used to wrap sweetness for her son. She placed the bag by the door and stood there longer than she needed, listening to the quiet thrum of the oven and the quieter thrum of her own heart saying, "Begin again." On the first day, she walked him to the bus stop. He stood with his shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear into the sweater. She touched his arm lightly. "You belong here," she said, the words simple and firm. He did not look at her, but he stood a little straighter when the bus pulled away. She watched until the yellow disappeared around the bend, then turned back toward the bakery with tears she did not wipe away. Flour rose when she set her hands to work, and for the first time in years the morning felt like a promise rather than a task. He came home that afternoon with a library card and a folded note from a teacher who wrote that he listened closely and worked hard. He spread his notebooks on the bakery counter while dough rose under a towel. She leaned beside him, sounding out words he stumbled on, showing him how to break a problem into pieces the way you cut butter into flour. He read a recipe aloud, just to practice, smiling when the words finally caught and held. She looked at him across the counter, the lamplight warm on his face, and thought, "I have been absent from life too long. This is how I return." The bakery itself became a second classroom. Together, they scrubbed dust from the shelves, polished the windows until sunlight spilled across the counters, and coaxed the oven back to life. She taught him how to knead dough with the heel of his palm, how to wait patiently for yeast to rise, how to shape rolls that would bake evenly. He listened with hungry concentration. She found herself smiling more often, her chest lighter, her voice steadier. For the first time in years, she was not only surviving, she was beginning again. But the boy was still 13, still restless, still carrying the scars of streets that had not been kind. One afternoon, he did not return after school. She waited, the ticking clock slicing through her patience. When he finally walked in, laughter clinging to him, the smell of smoke on his clothes, anger flared inside her. She demanded to know where he had been. He answered sharply, his eyes flashing with defiance. The kitchen filled with their voices, grief colliding with youthful rebellion. He shouted that she was not his real mother, that she could never understand him. The words cut deep. She turned away, tears burning her eyes. She had let her heart open, had dared to believe she could start over. And in a single outburst, he had ripped the wound raw again. For a moment, she almost believed him, believed she was a fool for thinking she could claim family again. Another day in the bakery, he burned a batch of rolls. The smell of charred bread hit her chest like a blow. She pulled the blackened tray from the oven and stared at it until her eyes blurred. Memories crashed down. Her son's laughter. The mornings filled with sweetness. The crash of metal on the highway that ended it all. Her body shook. She wept openly, clutching the tray as though it were a coffin. The boy froze, torn between guilt and pride. Shame twisted in him, but anger rose faster. He accused her of never truly seeing him, of loving ghosts more than him. His voice cracked with fury, but beneath it was fear that he would never belong, that her heart would always be elsewhere. That night the house stood in silence. She sat with her Bible open but unread, her eyes unfocused. She asked herself if she had been foolish to invite him in. She thought of the years wasted in mourning, the way she had locked away her life as if punishing herself for surviving. And then she thought of him, the boy with hungry eyes who reminded her not of her loss, but of her capacity to love again. Perhaps God was giving her one more chance. The silence stretched until he finally whispered across the room, "I'm sorry." His voice shook as if afraid she might not forgive. He lifted his head, his eyes glistening. "I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." Her heart broke open. She crossed the room, pulled him into her arms, feeling his body stiffen and then soften against her. Through her tears, she whispered the words she had been afraid to say. "You have brought warmth back into this house. For years it was cold, but you," her arms tightened around him. "You lit the fire again." In that embrace, something shifted permanently. She no longer saw herself as a woman buried with her past. She saw herself as someone who had chosen life again, someone who would fight for it. He no longer felt like a guest, but like a son. The next morning, the bakery glowed with light, the oven burning bright. The smell of bread drifted down the street, neighbors pausing to smile. Inside, she guided his clumsy hands as they shaped loaves together. For the first time in years, she felt not only that she was alive, but that life had begun again. More than 10 years had passed, yet he could still smell cinnamon when he thought about courage. The memory slid in under the noise of the hospital auditorium, the soft thud of seats folding up, the low buzz of colleagues finding places, the metallic click of a microphone springing to life. He stood at the lectern in a slate-gray suit that did not feel like him, a stack of slides ready, a title line glowing on the screen behind him. He had worked for this morning. He had slept in on call rooms, studied by flickering vending machines, and told himself that every step carried the warmth of a small bakery he once helped bring back to life. The department chairship would mean influence. Programs built the right way, a chance to pull other kids like him through doors that once stayed shut. He wrapped his fingers around the lectern edge and felt his pulse in his knuckles. At home, the house exhaled the slow air of late afternoon. She was nearly 50 now, a gracious 50. Though grief had left its quiet fingerprints, she had straightened, books on a shelf, and wiped a smudge from the kitchen clock, telling herself she would sit down for tea in 5 minutes. She drew in a breath and felt a catch, a tiny snag just below the breastbone. She paused and inhaled again. The snag sharpened into a thread of glass that pulled tight with each breath. She set the dishcloth down on the counter. The room swam a little at the edges. She told herself it was nothing. A small spasm, a warning to slow down. Then the glass thread turned into a fist. Back in the auditorium, he introduced his data. He clicked the remote and watched a graph rise and measured arcs. A resident in 28 on the third row took notes with a posture that tried too hard. A senior attending crossed his legs and whispered something that made a small circle laugh. He heard it, but did not hear it. His mouth moved, and the words came. Outcomes, access, equity, a new model for the clinic. And yet, under his voice, another voice walked barefoot through a kitchen, counting seconds while dough rose. She tried to breathe past the fist, but the fist got larger. Air thinned. The room narrowed. She reached for the back of a chair and found only the smooth face of the refrigerator. She blinked and told herself to stay calm, to keep the panic from turning the fist into a wall. She reached for the phone on the counter, thumb met it awake, and touched his name because she always touched his name when she needed steadiness. The call rang. The ringing seemed very far away, as if it belonged to someone else's afternoon. No answer. She swallowed against the rasp beginning in her throat. She tried again. No answer. The fear that had slept inside her for years sat upright and watched her. "Breathe like we practiced," his voice said from memory, not from the phone. "Stop. Plant your feet, elbows on your knees. Count your breaths like you are counting to forgiveness." She dropped into the chair by the window and leaned forward, palms on her thighs. She reached for the drawer beside the stove and fumbled it open. Spoons clinked. Rubber bands snapped at cold metal. She found the inhaler by its weight, by the feel of familiar edges. Her hands shook so badly she could not seat the spacer. She cursed at herself softly, then forced one breath out, one breath in, slow enough to steady the world. She fitted the pieces together, pressed, and drew medicine into her lungs. "Wait 10, he had told her. "Do not rush the medicine." She counted. The numbers fell apart. She counted again. He advanced to a slide about financial stewardship. He saw the bold header and felt a wave of nausea, sudden and shapeless. It moved through him like the shadow of a bird overhead. He shifted his weight, and the unease settled in his stomach. A second unease followed it, needle-fine, pricking the back of his neck. He did not believe in omens. He believed in evidence and practice. Still, his fingers loosened on the remote. He glanced down at the front row, then to the right, where his phone lay face down beside a printed handout. Something in him reached for it before his hand did. He flipped it over. One missed call. Her name, the timestamp, was a minute old. The auditorium noise went liquid, as if he were hearing it through water. He smoothed his tie with a gesture meant to buy a second of decision. There was no decision. His body decided before his mind caught up. He lifted his eyes and met the chair's expectant look. "I'm sorry," he said, voice steady in a way that surprised him. "I have to step out." A murmur rose at once, soft but sharp, like paper tearing. A colleague shifted back in his chair with a small, cynical smile. Someone's pen scratched a comment he did not want to read. He set the remote down, turned, and walked off the stage. By the time he reached the aisle, he was running. He ran down the back stairs 2 at a time, his hands skidding along the rail. The fluorescent corridor smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. He pushed through a fire door and hit daylight like a wave. A taxi rolled past, and he raised his arm, the motion urgent enough to draw the driver to the curb. He climbed in, gave the address, and then gripped the seat as the city slid by. Brick sycamore, a woman pushing a stroller, a boy in a hoodie looking at his phone. He counted the traffic lights and told himself to breathe evenly so he could give his breath away when he arrived. He thought of her sitting at the counter with steam lifting from a cup. He thought of the way she had pressed a lunch bag flat at the top, the way she had dotted an I on a form that had changed both their lives. "Hold on," he said in his head. "Hold on, I am coming." She drew again on the inhaler and felt a thin tunnel open in her chest, just enough air to believe. Her hands tingled. Sweat slid down her spine. She opened the window, even though it let, in cold air. She wanted the smell of trees, the shock of oxygen, anything that told her the world was bigger than the room. She leaned forward again and counted as if the numbers might build a bridge. 4 in, 6 out. 4 in, 6 out. The Wes scraped like sandpaper. She closed her eyes and pictured a church pew, a small hand slipping into hers, a promise she had made without words. Begin again, she told herself. We began again. Do not stop now. The taxi braked at the corner, and he lurched against the strap. He tossed cash toward the front and shouted a thank you as he pushed the door open. He ran up the walkway so fast he clipped his shoulder on the gate post. The keys stuck in the lock because his hands were slick. He wiped them on his jacket and tried again. The door swung inward. Mom! His voice cracked on the second syllable. He hated the crack. Adored the word. No answer. He crossed the living room in 2 strides. The kitchen light was on. She sat at the chair by the window, her body pitched forward, her face pale with effort. The inhaler clenched in her hand like a tool and a prayer. He dropped to his knees beside her. I'm here, he said, and the steadiness in his voice returned like muscle memory. Look at me. She lifted her eyes. Fear flashed there, then relief. Then something deeper that made his chest hurt. He slid one hand to her back and felt the rapid rise and fall beneath his palm. He set the spacer, pressed the canister, and counted out loud so she could borrow his numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. She pulled the medicine in and held it, eyes fixed on his mouth like she could read safety in the shapes of his words. He opened the window wider and turned the small fan on low. He measured her breaths the way he used to measure oven heat. Careful, attentive, ready to adjust. Another wave came. She choked on it, panic threatening to burst the careful rhythm. He leaned closer, until his forehead nearly touched hers. With me, he said softly. Breathe with me. We have done hard things. We can do this. He pressed the canister again, and she drew the medicine in. This time, finding the count on her own. The Wes lifted half a note. He felt tears gather, but did not let them fall. His job in this instant was steadiness. She felt his hand on her back and realized that all the years between 13 and this moment were a single line connecting breath to breath. Her lungs fought and then surrendered, fighting again because habit is stubborn. She fixed her eyes on the hollow of his throat, on the small pulse there, and let his counting replace the roar in her head. She wanted to tell him she had been brave all morning until the brave ran out. She wanted to tell him she had not meant to pull him from his life. Instead, she pressed her fingers against his wrist and held on. The room changed slowly. The air lost its knives. The tunnel widened. She drew in a breath that did not seize and looked at him with startled gratitude, as if she had found a door in a wall she had stopped believing could open. Her shoulders dropped a fraction. He felt it and exhaled, a long breath he had kept caged since the taxi turned onto their street. He listened one more breath, then the next. Then a third that sounded almost like the soft exhale she made when a loaf came out right. They did not speak for a long time. Words would have knocked something delicate off its shelf. He rested his forehead against hers and let their breaths find a shared rhythm. Outside, a car passed. A dog barked twice. A neighbor called to a child to come in from the yard. The window let in a thin slice of evening air that smelled faintly of leaf mold and the first shy promise of rain. I left, he said at last, the admission small and fierce. I walked out. A dozen faces flickered across his mind. Kolu, mentors, the tight-lipped man who loved rules more than people. They faded like old light. I would do it again. She closed her eyes and let 2 tears roll down. The tears did not feel like defeat. They felt like release. She reached up, cupped the side of his face, and nodded once. No speech would carry what passed between them. He slid his arms around her and drew her against his chest. She leaned into him, listening to the thud of his heart, the way she used to listen to the thrum of the oven. The kitchen lamp threw a soft circle over the floor, and within that circle they held on, as if the holding itself were medicine. The crisis had not vanished. It had stepped back. He kept his ear tuned to the music of her breathing, ready to move if a wrong note returned. She kept her eyes on his, drawing confidence from their calm, drawing warmth from his nearness, the way she once drew warmth from bread rising under a towel. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. She smiled, small, tired, dazzling, because she could. In the dim room with the window open and the world still turning, a simple truth settled over them like a blanket. Titles could wait. Applause could wait. Breath could not. He tightened his arms and she let herself be held. Somewhere, a clock ticked. They listened to it together, not as a countdown, but as a steady reminder that time, like breath, is taken one beat at a time. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and he sat beside her, gripping the rail of the stretcher as the siren wailed through the streets. Her breath had steadied enough to keep fear at bay, yet her chest still rose in uneven waves. She turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes, and whispered through the oxygen mask, "I'm all right now." He shook his head gently, refusing to let her comfort him when he could not bear the thought of almost losing her. His hand tightened around hers as the hospital lights grew closer with every block. Inside the emergency bay, nurses rushed forward, wheeling her toward triage. He followed with the stubbornness of a son who would not be left behind. He signed forms with a trembling hand, his name flowing across papers where it had never been before. He knew the faces in the room, colleagues, nurses he had trained beside, interns who looked at him with wide eyes. Yet in their glances, he also caught whispers. The sidelong look of curiosity sharpened into judgment. Hours later, after she had been settled in a room and her breathing had returned to a fragile rhythm, he stepped into the corridor. Word had already spread. The presentation had ended without him, his candidacy for the chair all but ruined. 2 doctors stood by the nurses' station, their voices pitched just loud enough to be overheard. "He walked out because he was afraid," one said. All that talk about innovation, and when it mattered, he couldn't stand the pressure. The other laughed softly, shaking his head. "You don't quit a presentation unless you're running from failure. He'll never recover from this." He felt the words like stones against his chest, but he did not answer. He carried his silence like armor. He knew the truth, and the truth was simple. Her life was worth more than any title. He had not chosen failure. He had chosen her. Still, the sting of their mockery pressed hard, the echo of laughter following him down the hall like a shadow. He returned to her room, pulling a chair close to the bed. She was pale but awake, her eyes steady despite the weakness in her body. She studied him quietly, reading the heaviness in his shoulders. "They're saying things, aren't they?" she asked, softly. He nodded once, unable to speak. She reached for his hand, her fingers cool but firm. "Let them talk. They don't know our story, but they will." The next day, against medical advice, she asked to be helped into the wheelchair and taken to the main auditorium. He tried to stop her, but she insisted, her voice carrying the same resolve that had once reopened a bakery after years of silence. "This is not just your burden," she told him. "It belongs to both of us." The auditorium was still humming with conversation when the doors opened and she was wheeled inside. Heads turned, some smirked, some frowned, some whispered her name as though she had stepped from a rumor into flesh. He walked beside her, steadying the chair as she asked to be brought forward. The murmur fell into quiet when she lifted the microphone with trembling hands. Her voice was thin at first, yet every word carried weight. She told them about the accident that had taken her husband and child, about the bakery that had gone dark, about the years she had lived as though she were already buried. She spoke of a Sunday morning, of an empty pew, of a boy who slipped into her loneliness and took her hand when no one else saw her. She paused, gathering strength, and the room waited in silence. She spoke of how she had opened her door to him, how they had swept the dust from a forgotten kitchen, how the smell of bread had returned not only to her house, but to her heart. She admitted there had been arguments, mistakes, burned loaves, and broken tempers. But through it all, love had grown, unexpected, undeserved, unbreakable. Her eyes glistened as she turned toward him. "This man whom you call your colleague is my son, not by blood, but by choice, by the grace of God, by the power of love that would not let either of us stay alone. When I called him yesterday, it was not weakness that brought him home. It was love, and if he had not come, I would not be standing here now." The auditorium fell utterly still. The hum of the air vents was the only sound. He felt the sting in his eyes, the flood of memory, flour dust on a counter, the first school shirt from a thrift store, the moment she whispered that he had brought warmth back into her house. He bowed his head, overcome. Then something shifted in the crowd. A young doctor in the second row pulled out his phone, his face pale. He pressed a button, lifted the device to his ear, and whispered, "Hi, Mom. I just wanted to hear your voice." A nurse at the edge of the room covered her mouth, tears slipping through her fingers. Another whispered to the colleague beside her, "I don't ever want to be the one who regrets not answering." The silence deepened heavy, not with judgment, but with conviction. Some bowed their heads, some wiped their eyes. In that space, the story of a widow and a boy who became family filled the air more powerfully than charts or graphs ever could. He knelt beside her chair, took her hand, and pressed it to his forehead. The hall, full of colleagues and strangers alike, watched as a truth beyond medicine settled over them. Success measured only in titles was hollow, but success measured in love could never be taken away. The decision came quietly, slipped into a short announcement at the next staff meeting. Another name was chosen for chair of the department. His own was never spoken. He felt the moment land inside him, like a stone dropped into water, rippling outward with echoes of effort lost, hours spent, dreams deferred. He looked at the polished table, at the reflections of papers and pens, and understood that his path would not climb in the way he had once imagined. For a heartbeat, he wanted to resist, to argue, to defend. But the resistance faded, replaced by something heavier and yet gentler: acceptance. He left the meeting and walked down the long corridor, his steps echoing off the tile. A few colleagues offered sympathetic nods, others avoided his eyes. Yet in each face, he saw the memory of the story his mother had told, the story that had broken their silence and shifted their hearts. He realized he had not won a title, but he had become something titles could not measure. In the cafeteria line, he heard two interns whisper about calling their parents. In the lounge, he saw a senior physician setting his phone aside and saying, softly, "If my wife calls, I'll answer right away." He understood then that what had been lost in one room had spread quietly through the hospital like the smell of bread through a street. At home, she recovered slowly. Her color returned. Her breath steadied. Her laugh came back in small bursts that warmed the house. One morning, she stood at the kitchen window and said, "It's time." He followed her into the bakery at the back of the house. The oven had stood waiting, silent but not forgotten. Together they cleaned, arranged trays, and set the fire roaring. She kneaded dough with practiced hands, her palms pressing memory into flour. He measured, timed, and checked temperatures with the precision of a physician. The loaves rose golden, the air swelled with sweetness, and the house filled with the scent that had once been lost, but was now reborn. He stood in his white coat with flour dusted across the sleeves, smiling at the contradiction. She laughed at the sight of him, shaking her head. "You can heal bodies in the morning and shaped bread in the evening," she said. "Both are needed." He looked at her at the strength etched into her face, and thought of the night she had wept into burned loaves, of the morning she had signed her name on a school form as guardian, of the story she had carried into the auditorium like a banner. Gratitude rose in his chest until it felt like another breath, larger and steadier than all the rest. The neighbors noticed. Children tugged at their mothers' sleeves, asking for rolls. Old men leaned on canes outside the door, inhaling deeply before stepping in. The bakery became not just a place to eat, but a place to gather. Nurses from the hospital came by, some shy, some tearful, admitting that her words had reminded them of what they had nearly forgotten. He listened quietly, wiping flour from the counter while she handed out bread with the same tenderness she had once poured into raising him. One Sunday, weeks later, they returned to the church where everything had begun. The sanctuary looked the same, yet nothing was the same. Families filled the pews as always. Voices rose in hymns. Light streamed across the wooden floor, but the pew that had once been empty was no longer hollow. They sat together, side by side, their shoulders touching, their hands resting close. The smell of fresh bread clung to their clothes, carried in from the morning's work, a sweet undercurrent beneath the incense of candles. As the congregation joined hands, they did not hesitate. Their fingers intertwined naturally without fear, without surprise. She glanced around and saw not isolation, but inclusion, not absence, but abundance. He closed his eyes and felt no longer the boy on the outside looking in, but a man who had found his place, a son who had chosen and been chosen. The voices rose higher, the hymns swelling. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, catching on their joined hands, gilding them in gold. The bakery, the hospital, the streets of the town, all of it seemed to gather in that moment. Family was not blood. Family was not title. Family was the seat beside you, the hand in yours, the courage to begin again after loss. The bell tolled, above the church, deep and resonant. She lifted her head and smiled through tears. He squeezed her hand gently, anchoring them both. The pew that had once been empty was now filled, overflowing with light, with love, with the quiet truth of a promise kept. And as the hymn faded into silence, the sound of their hearts remained steady as breath, eternal as grace. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.